have using the comment section on Facebook, and we'll be monitoring those comments and answering those questions at the end of the tour as well. Lastly, this tour is being recorded and streamed live and will be posted to our social media channels once the tour is over. If you'd like to rewatch this tour or other tours put on by the museum previously, please check out our YouTube or our Facebook pages to find those. Without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce Karen, who will be presenting on early Renaissance painting in Florence, Siena, and Venice. Thank you so much for being with us today, and I'll turn things over to you, Karen.
Thank you so much, Ilse. As Ilse mentioned, we do like to have questions. It's wonderful to create a dialogue about some of the artworks, and I really encourage it. Ilse will appear about 5 minutes at the end of the talk, and that will allow some of us to have a discussion. So again, there's the comment section, and then of course, at the end of the lecture, if you feel something really important, you can put it on in the chat, but normally we do the questions toward the end. So welcome to this presentation on early Renaissance painting. We will be talking a little bit of the Proto-Renaissance that eases us in from the Middle Ages, the medieval times, and then we also will be looking at artwork that hedges on the high Renaissance, and that is true for the work of Botticelli. We will not be talking about the high Renaissance artists like Michelangelo, Raphael, Leonardo, but as I said, Botticelli does kind of edge on the high Renaissance, so there's a little bit of a flexibility, we shall say. So this early Renaissance painting discussion will be in Florence, Siena, and Venice, and primarily in Florence and of course Siena, because those are the two centers for early Renaissance art. Now, speaking of that, I want to tell you a little bit about what is happening in Europe at the time. Remember, there is the Northern Renaissance. We have great artists creating artwork in the north, in the area of the Netherlandish regions, which eventually became Holland and Belgium, but we're going to center on the Italian Renaissance. What are the characteristics of the Italian Renaissance? Well, there's a break from the Middle Ages, this focus on sort of the afterlife. They are more interested in humanism. Petrarch creates this interest in humanism. He's one of them, the writers who promotes humanism, and humanism is really focusing on human growth, intellectual endeavor, and not so controlled so much by religion. We also have an early interest in the classics, Greco-Roman art and architecture. Remember, Italy has a plethora of Greco-Roman antiquities to look at, so there's an interest in that. We also have great wealth developing at this time, particularly with families like the Gonzaga, the Medici in Florence. We also have Strozzi family. So there's many high-powered families that are supporting these artists along with the church. Now, what's interesting about the Medicis is they actually had 3 members of the family who were part of the papacy. So we do have this mixture of cultural and intellectual development along with the church. Now, I am not going to be showing you a lot of portraiture, not that portraiture wasn't developed at this time. We really see a lot of portraiture around 1430, 1450. You will see some portraiture. Many of these artworks do, however, incorporate forms of portraiture in the donors and in the religious figures. You're also going to see a lot of the development of early landscape in these Renaissance paintings. So without further ado, I'm going to begin with Giotto. And Giotto is considered the father of early Renaissance painting in Italy, in Florence, that is, because we have Duccio in Siena and Giotto in Florence. Now, what are the characteristics of Giotto's work? He really breaks so much from straight medieval painting. We have a much more naturalistic form of the human body, or of course, the bodies of the Holy Family, for example, as we have mother and child here. We also see an interest in color, a little bit of light, three-dimensionality. We also have the beginning use of architectural elements in artwork. Now, remember, the Byzantine Empire doesn't end till the middle part of the 15th century. So we still see this influence on the Eastern Orthodox realm which is centered in Constantinople. And remember, there was a lot of trade going on from Constantinople into Venice, into Naples, and other cities. So these Italian artists are very well aware of the Byzantine style. Another thing coming from the north would be the interest in the international Gothic style, which we will look at a little bit later. So there's other stylistic concerns that will be influencing the early Renaissance. As I just mentioned, Byzantine Empire, the international Gothic style, which is very much centered in France, and that will be discussed as we continue the lecture. Now, when we see Onnisante Madonna, this was commissioned by the Humiliati, a group of Catholic worshipers, and it commissioned this beautiful work on panel. Now, we have two kinds of forms of art that we're going to be looking at. One is fresco, and the other is wood panel. We're not looking at canvas here, we're looking at wood panel. And the use of tempera. Now, oil painting does exist beginning in the 11th century. However, we really do not see a tremendous use until the early 15th century. Now, it is said that Jan van Eyck developed oil painting. He didn't invent it. As I mentioned, it begins in the 11th century, but he did help to evolve it. Now, it was an artist from Italy who, Damascena, Antonello Damascena, who actually brings oil painting about 1430 to Italy. So that's a little bit later than what we're looking at here. Here we see the use of egg tempera. We also see the use of gold leaf, magnificent gold leaf, which links Giotto's work to the Byzantine Empire. But we see the Maesta Madonna here. What is the Maesta Madonna? Remember, there's many versions of the Madonna seen throughout art history. The Madonna of Humility, the Maesta Madonna, the Sacred Conversazione. There's so many different elements, but this one, the Maesta Madonna, is when there are angels and prophets that surround her, and we have her sitting in an elaborate throne. You can see the use of beautiful colors, the soft modeling of her face, the exquisite outline of gold on her garments. Remember, Madonna often is seen with red and blue. We have the halos. And again, as I mentioned, the beginning use of this architecture in a fresco or a panel. Now, many times these would be like the central panel of a triptych, polyptych. We have multiple imagery on these panels, but this is the central panel. I'm going to move on because I can kind of make a really deep comparison here. Now, you might say, well, you fast forward about 100 years. I do want to show you, and I will be going back to a little bit earlier times, but I want to show you this evolution of architectural elements in painting. Now, this is a fresco in Santa Maria Novella in Florence, and it was greatly, and Masaccio was a great painter of the architectural elements. Where does he learn that? He learned some of this from Brunelleschi, one of the greatest early Renaissance architects. He does the dome of the Florence Cathedral. He's an engineer, he's a mathematician, an architect, and Masaccio was aware in Florence of his work. Now, what about this fresco? It's amazing. Now, remember, frescoes are when wet paint, particularly egg tempera, is applied to the wall. Later, oil painting is incorporated, but wet paint is put on the wet plaster. And as it dries, the image is becomes part of a wall. So it is a form of painting on walls. Now, what do we have here? We have di sotto in su, which means from looking from the bottom up. We see brilliant use of trompe-l'oeil, fool the eye in French, because it's very difficult not to think of this as actually three-dimensional. Remember, the fresco is a two-dimensional form that shows three-dimensionality. Now, we have this barrel vault, and we have these Corinthian capitals. Corinthian capitals were part of ancient Greece. We had the beginning of the use of capitals with the Doric capitals, which become Ionic, which are more feminine. And then we have, during the Hellenistic period, these Corinthian capitals, but they, of course, are incorporated in many early Renaissance works of art. So we have the Holy Trinity, and we have the crucifixion, and we have the donors here. But what is so remarkable, as God is standing in this corbelled vault, we see a very unusual presentation of God, because you can see him standing. Normally, in the medieval times, God was seen as a hand or a disembodied face, not this very fully formed man. And you actually, in a kind of a little bit of a humorous element, you actually see one foot edging over the ledge. Okay, so that the Holy Family, Joseph and Mary, Jesus and God, we have the donors, and then we have all kinds of architectural elements that are meant to fool the eye. We have a very recessed vault, and then we have here a memento mori. We have a skeleton representing Adam, and it also represents the potential of death in all our lives, the fleeting nature of life. We have more muted colors here with the Masaccio as compared to, if we look a little this earlier, this Giotto, the colors are a little bit richer. Masaccio's palette was a little more subdued. Now, we're going to move on to another piece, another fresco in the Brancossi Chapel in Florence, and that is Expulsion from the Garden of Eden, which comes from the book of Genesis. It's a very unusual representation, very vertical in structure, and also incorporating elements we don't often see in the Expulsion from the Garden of Eden. There is no greenery, flora. We do see something that is almost never seen before. Masaccio is one of the first to incorporate that. And this is an architectural niche or a doorway. Very unusual. And we have just one angel cherub hovering with a sword with this beautiful red cloak. And then we have something that is kind of, I apologize, my computer is a little bit quick on the draw. Something that's kind of unusual, a fully naked Adam. Now, one of the Medici family, might have been, I can't remember if it's Lorenzo or Cosimo, who are the two really main Medici sponsors, but they were a little taken aback by the nudity. And so a fig leaf was applied after. This is before the fig leaf was applied. And you see, it's interesting about Adam, he covers his face in torment, and Eve is crying in great tragedy and sorrow. But if you have studied some of the proto-Renaissance or middle work from the Middle Ages, you often see a very spiritual kind of form of the body. This is much more humanistic, as I mentioned, this interest in humanism, a fully formed male figure and female figure, using kind of the styles that were popular during the Renaissance, more elongated forms. That was very Florentine, and more on the slimmer side. Now, because we have so many great artworks to talk about, I want to move on to Fra Angelico. He was a Franciscan friar working in Florence, and this is for the Covenant of San Marco. It also is a fresco applied to a wet wall and dried into a church or a convent. And this is one of the most beautiful, I think, my way of thinking of the Annunciation. And Fra Angelico has a little bit of the International Gothic style still part of his repertoire. And the International Gothic style had a very sinewy, very kind of ethereal line, very beautifully embellished. That was typical of Florentine art, a lot of embellishments, and rather elongated figures. Now, remember what I said. Now, this is hedging toward the middle part of the 15th century. So we're getting into really the meat of the early Renaissance, almost hedging toward a little bit of the high Renaissance. But look how amazingly well he captures this loggia, this kind of open court, and these wonderful Corinthian capitals on top of these pillars. And then, of course, these arches. Remember, the arch comes from Roman antiquity. The Romans were the developers of the arch. Remember, the Greeks used post and lintel, square top, and a post, whereas the Romans developed the arch, and that's kind of important in this. And we have these medallions, these beautiful fluted Corinthian capitals. We actually have some elements of Ionic capitals. That is very feminine. This is rather a more feminine topic. And then we have this recessed passageway with a window, so magnificent. And then Gabriel approaches the Madonna to tell her of the Immaculate Conception. And he kneels in a very gracious way, humbled way. And then, of course, if you look at this detailed hair, very carefully detailed. And again, my computer is moving a little too quickly. Let's go back. And what's sort of remarkable, not only the detail on the dress, but look at these wings, these rainbow wings, so remarkable, so beautiful. And then, of course, this immaculately depicted garden with all manner of cypress trees and white delicate flowers, probably with reference to the Madonna and purity, although usually it's the white lily. And then, of course, this marvelous fence, very, very traditional fence. And so again, here we have a religious theme with beautiful portraits of the Madonna and the angel Gabriel. Now, we're going to move to a slightly different part of the country. Remember, I told you we're going to be concentrating on Florence, Siena, and Venice, but there were some artists who kind of moved around. And one of them was Andrea Mantegna. Mantegna actually married into the famous Venetian Renaissance family, the Bellini, Jacopo, Giorgione, Jacopo and Gentile. So we have this family of amazing Bellinis who were sort of the master artists of Venice. Mantegna marries one of the Bellinis, the sister, and he creates his own really individual style. Now, he worked for the Gonzaga court in Mantua. And Mantua is in the Lombardy region, which is not part of Tuscany, which we talk about primarily when we talk about Florence and Siena. Remember, Venice is outside of Tuscany, as is Mantua. And there, of course, the Medici family gets the most play because of their connection to Florence, but other families, Strozzi, Sforzi, Gonzaga, and the Gonzagas, because they weren't in Florence, they were a little bit of a off-brand aristocratic family, but they did sponsor a lot of artists. The other point I want to make is in the early Renaissance, and as we edge into the middle and high Renaissance, you have to remember that it's no longer just about religious subject matter, as we saw in the Middle Ages. You would never see something like this in the Middle Ages. So this fresco is so humorous and remarkable. It's called the Camera degli Sposi, and it is the salon of a married couple, sposi meaning spouse. And it was meant for really as a sort of a private reception area. We have two aspects of this. We're not seeing the entire room, but we're seeing a great portion of it. And it's really hard to discern with this trompe l'oeil effect what is actually part of the architectural elements of the room and what, of course, is the trompe l'oeil. So let's look first at the true architectural elements. We actually do have a fireplace. That is part of the room. We have a doorway, a narrow doorway, and then we have another door, and then there's some windows that we're not really seeing. We have these medallions that are painted on the ceiling, and these represent the emperors of Rome, because what a lot of these highborn families who I just named, they wanted to show, listen, we are so strong and powerful. We're like Rome was at its heyday. So that's a reference to that. We have these little putti holding them up, little cherubs. We have some interesting elements, narratives of the Gonzaga family. For example, one of the Gonzagas, the son of, I believe, Ludovico, who commissioned this, the son is in papal dress, if you can see it here. That is because, pardon me, that is because and I skipped a piece, and we're going to have to go back because it's truly remarkable. That is because he had just been made part of the papal court. So his son is seen with his wife holding the hand of their child, and the father is greeting him with much admiration. We also see Ludovico, I believe it's Ludovico Gonzaga. He is being greeted by his courtiers and servants and people who help him. And he is kind of being spoken to. He was reading a letter. You can see that here, and they come to give him some kind of information. We have the Putti holding up a placard, and we have exquisite countryside of the Lombardy countryside here with beautiful animals and gorgeous clouds. Remember, during the Renaissance and early Renaissance and middle and high, we begin to see the incorporation of landscape, and we begin to see the incorporation of non-religious figures, telling narratives about the life of this really important family. No talk of the Camerella degli Sposi would be appropriate without this wonderful oculus. Now, this is the oculus that inspired Correggio later on, for example. It really is just humorous and exquisite. So this is painted on the ceiling of the room, and it's meant to look like an opening, like a skylight. Of course, it's all trompe l'oeil, fool the eye. And we have this wonderful tondo style. We have a balustrade, like a balcony, and the figures we have the little putti, the little cherubs, and then we have a peacock. And peacocks often meant respect and royalty, and they're often used in these aristocratic households. We have a gorgeous cloud formation, and then we have these servants looking down as if they can see what's happening in these intimate chambers. Now, the Camerella degli Sposi had like bedrooms, but they also had receptions. So it was semi-private for the Gonzaga family. And we also see some humorous elements, the little backside, it looks like, of the little cherub. So many interesting elements in these walled frescoes. Now, we're going to move on because I did miss this really important painting done a little bit earlier. This is an oil and tempera on panel. And as I mentioned, it was around 1430 when oil painting was introduced to Italy. And so we have the use, as you see, oil and tempera is beginning to be utilized. This is on panel. We're not seeing canvas yet. And this is done by Piero della Francesca. Piero della Francesca worked mostly in Florence, and he was a very important mathematician. He was a mathematician. He wrote treatises on mathematical theory. And so you can see all manner of perspective incorporated into this diptych. Now, a diptych which is two panel, of course, triptych, three panel, we can go on. A diptych in this case, this is a very small piece. And the diptych is not separated as you might see in other artworks, but this is a diptych in two formations. So you have this Corinthian capital with fluting that divides the two painting. And what do we have? We have Pontius Pilate on a chair watching the flagellation of Christ. And we have him, the whip here, and it's not mentioned how many blows he received, but stands to reason that was a very difficult situation in the Passion of Christ. We have a Greco-Roman golden sculpture here on top of a Corinthian capital. We have some attendants here with Pilate, and we have this amazing three-dimensional architectural room. We have a corbelled roof. We have light pouring in. This light is right here. We have a staircase where light again is pouring in, and this very complex floor, checkered floor. Now, an interesting thing I'd like to mention is that even in contemporary times, works from the Renaissance, for example, and antiquity, still are not always fully understood. And that is the case with this flagellation of Christ, because it has been detailed in many different ways who these men represent. Some say it is a very metaphorical reference to Christ's life. Others say that these three men, these highborn aristocrats, lost their sons in some terrible way, and they were commiserating with what will be happening to Christ. Others think this was the donor, the aristocrat who commissioned this painting, and then his attendants. It was also said that these three men were killed during a coup attempt. So many stories are bantered back and forth about who these men are, and I cannot tell you the definitive answer at this point. Now, what's really important, however, the figures is, again, this use of perspective, the very three-dimensional aspects of this diptych, stylized diptych, but look again also at the emotions on the face of this figure. Highly emotional, very profoundly deep in thought. And then, of course, another element to this is the very three-dimensional realistic form of the human figure. We did not see that in the Byzantine Empire. We did not see that in medieval times. Just beginning to see it when the Proto-Renaissance emerges. Now, also look at the exquisite detailing of the robes here and the forming of the cloth, the cloak, and the exquisite sky with, again, these Florentine architectural elements. So Piero della Francesca, an amazing mathematician who really helped push forward three-dimensionality in art. Now, so just to go back to the Camera della Sposi, I just want to show you that not only was Mantegna brilliant at capturing non-religious subject matter, but we also have his brilliance in capturing a religious nature. This is, again, now we're really hedging into the high Renaissance, but I did want to incorporate because there is, a little bit of crossover, but this is one of the most remarkable paintings of this time period, the Lamentation over the Dead Christ. Now you can see that the first is colorful and exquisite and almost frivolous. This is serious and profoundly sad, elegiac as it were. What we have is a remarkable perspective foreshortening. If it were to be done in realistic proportions, Christ's feet would be up to about his knees. Well, maybe not that high, but right here to the shin. And why are the feet first? Well, there's a couple things. Remember, Mary washed the feet of Christ. Your feet are your vulnerable, your low point. So it kind of harkens to that. And this is a death scene. Christ is on this marble slab. It's cold. It's inhumane. It is meant to be like a mortuary setting. And then we have Mary Magdalene, St. John, and Mary hovering over in angst and agony. And then we have Christ leaning. His face does not lean toward the worshipers. It leans toward God. So his head is tilted this way. We see the stigmata, very cruel in the feet and the hands. We see a very developed thorax. And actually, we also see somewhat the lower regions a little bit developed too, which I believe harkens to rebirth. And this exquisite drapery, many folds of the drapery. And so if you look carefully, just take a moment to look carefully, because this is all in a very odd perspective. But of course, it works brilliantly to convey the sorrow on the death of Jesus. Now, we're going to move on to one of the masters of the early to high Renaissance, and that is Sandro Botticelli. Botticelli worked primarily in Florence, and he worked for the Medici family. He was a prodigy, very active and fanciful and well-respected, and a genius at painting. He actually did some work in Rome, and he did frescoes along with in the sorry, I'm losing my train of thought, but he did work in Rome. He painted frescoes. He did, however, work primarily in Florence. Now, why is this such a remarkable painting? Well, first of all, we're moving out of the realm of just religious paintings, and we're looking at Greco-Roman stories and elements. And so Botticelli painted a series of works. This is on tempera. It's a panel painting, and it is in the Uffizi. It's just such a remarkable piece. But he moved into doing Greco-Roman stories, mythology, as this is. And there were a number of them, I think about a half dozen. You're going to see one other. And this is an amazing La Primavera, one of the masters of Renaissance painting, Italian Renaissance painting. So what do we have here? We have Venus, the goddess of love and beauty, Aphrodite, as it were. Venus is the Roman name, of course. And she is welcoming the viewer into her garden. She actually holds up her hand in a welcoming gesture. And what is so remarkable to me, as someone who is a devotee of flowers, I love flowers and their representations and their beauty, but over 190 floral specific species of flowers are depicted here, and something like hundreds of different plants too are shown here. And then of course we have the oranges, which were the symbol, one of the symbols of the Medici. And we have, excuse me, we have some other aspects of Greek mythology present. We have the three graces here, and they hold their hands up in sort of a dance. Remember, primavera means spring, and there's elements of spring throughout this painting. The style of the figuration here is very Florentine Renaissance, more elongated and sinuous. We have the colors of the Medici, these muted cream, rounds and creams that were the Medici colors. We have the god Hermes, the messenger god, sometimes called Mercury in Roman. And so Hermes is holding his hand up in gesture, and he has his winged sandals. Now, here we have the goddesses of the seasons, the Horae, Horae, and Zephyr is trying to grab one. He's kind of fallen in love with this representation of the seasons, this goddess, and she escapes him and goes into another form of her own body, and that one is clothed as an aristocrat with this exquisite diaphanous drapery. And again, you see all this manner of diaphanous clothing on the graces, and as well as the Horae. And another thing you can see is a little cherub of her son, and he is Cupid. He's about to shoot an arrow because we're dealing with the goddess of love. So, and take a look at this remarkable Zephyr. His ability to capture not only the beauty of flora and fauna, the diaphanous exquisite drapes, the manner of dress, of folded cloaks, the beautiful feet and hands and face. And he was known, like Raphael a little bit later, to paint the most exquisite female form. This, of course, is not religious, but just the capturing of beauty. Now, wait, we'll go back one more time. Now, this is another element of the series on Greco-Roman themes, and this is the birth of Venus. And again, this is in the Uffizi, a remarkable panel painting, and you can see how Venus, Aphrodite, emerges as a fully formed woman, which comes from Greek mythology, and she does not start as an infant. She rises from the sea, and she is on a shell. And I remember in graduate school in art history, we used to say, we didn't call this the birth of Venus, we called it Venus on the half shell. I don't know if that funny line is passed into common usage, but we certainly thought that was amusing. And so this pearlized shell that sort of mirrors her exquisite form, again, this idealized beauty, this Florentine style. And we have the Zephyr with this, with his love. And this is taken, this particular image is taken from one of the Medici's Roman sculptures that they actually had in one of their palaces. So that is kind of modeled definitely on a Greco-Roman sculpture. And then we have one of the goddesses of the season, Hore, H-O-R-A-E, is trying to clothe her nudity and wants to put her in a more modest clothing, although she does appear somewhat in a modest stylistically because her hair covers part of her body and as her hand covers her breast. But look at, there's this form of the wind as the zephyr blows her to the shore. That is what the zephyr is doing. He's trying to blow the shell to the shore right here. And again, you see this use of trees, the flora and fauna, which is very typical of work by Botticelli. But she is considered, this birth of Venus, the goddess of love and beauty, to really reveal how exquisite she was. And Botticelli, of course, makes her the most elegant. Now, because of time, we're going to move on. The Gentile de Fabriano was a very remarkable artist. And what this was done a little bit earlier, and it is more in what we call the International Gothic style. The International Gothic style was very closely developed in Avignon, and it passed into the Netherlandish regions, which actually had some French control, and then it goes into Italy. Remember, there's a lot of cross-pollination. Art does not exist in a vacuum. If you recall, a number of years ago, the Huntington Library had a brilliant portrait exhibition called From Flanders to Florence, showing how the North very much inspired Italian Renaissance. And Gentile de Fabriano is kind of an amalgamation of not only the developments in Italy, but also what is happening in France and in the North. So the International Gothic style, as I started to say, is highly decorative. In fact, there's jewels embedded here. It's very elegant. It's very aristocratic. In these wealthy courts in Avignon, for example, we have all kinds of manner of embellishment. And this is part of what we call a predella. And a predella would be down here, these aspects of narration down at the bottom. And predellas were often very elaborate altarpieces, as is this. Now we have this gold frame, and this can actually be detached from the painting. And it was one of the first in all of art history that we see this kind of configuration. So we have the adoration of the Magi here, the earthly kings coming to acknowledge the birth of Jesus, but we have all manner of contemporary to that time aristocrats. And the aristocrat, I believe it's the Strozzi family, commissioned this, Paolo Strozzi, and he is shown here with the red hat. And there is also, and I can't really see it if it were enlarged, I might, but supposedly, and maybe you can see it, there is a falconer, someone holding a falcon, as was typical of the aristocratic activities. And we also see some really amazing animals. We have a little monkey, we have horses, of course, and greyhounds, but there's also, I believe, a wild cat somewhere here. So all manner of exotica and birds. And then we have the aristocrats going into one of the castles. So there's detailing the life of the family who commissioned it, but also viewing this religious scene. We have the cattle and the manger. Now we have God seen as the Pantocrator, kind of overlooking, this scene. We have all kinds of gold leaf and gold used in the frame, painted on the frame, and all these medallions and Corinthian capitals. So it's very elaborate. And look at, this is more of a shallow space though. You don't see that kind of deep recessive space, as we say in Piero della Francesca. This is more a crowding, and it's kind of meant to be in that sort of picture plane. It is not so interested in showing perspective, those octagonals that we saw in Brunelleschi's fresco, but we do see a much more three-dimensional form here. And of course, I'm needing to move on. Pablo Uccello was also Florentine, and this is the Battle of San Romano. Now, the Battle of San Romano only lasted 8 hours, and it was between Florence and Siena. They were both vying for kind of being the center of Renaissance culture and art. And this is part of, I believe there were 3 of these panels done. And we see that it is the battle scene. As I say, the battle only lasted 8 hours. And this one, I believe, is supposed to be in the morning, because not only were times of day shown in these, but also these battle scenes. And one is in the National Gallery, another one is in the Louvre. This one, of course, is in the Uffizi. Now, Uccello had a very interesting stylistic manner. You can see the horses are very muscular, and they move, they kick, and we have all manner of soldiers and animals and rock formations and spheres and these kind of octagonal lines that go up, and horses that have been maimed. And so it was a pretty vicious battle. But I will say that Florence did come out ahead, and Florence had come out ahead because unfortunately during the early part of the Renaissance, Siena was really hit heavily by the plague in the 14th century. By 1348, half of the city of Siena had been decimated by plague. Now, because of time, we're going to move on a little bit. This is another really kind of remarkable painting by Uccello. And it represents St. George and the dragon. And this is a really fanciful representation. Remember, St. George fights evil or Satan personified in this dragon. We have a princess holding the dragon on a leash. He spews fire and blood, and we see him emerging from this really fanciful cave. And then we have the eye of the storm. And what's so interesting is the storm represents divine intervention, because the eye of the storm directly links to this diagonal line, which is the spear in which he impales the eye of the dragon, and St. George becomes victorious. But you can see the use of this very unique style of Uccello with these very muscular horses and very rounded forms with the animals. Not so much here with this very wispy, thin princess. Okay, for time's sake, I'm just going to go on. Now, I want to go into Siena. And Duccio was the Giotto of the Sienese school. And the Sienese school was pretty remarkable for its stylistic manner. It is, I would say it's very, it's more elegant. It's not as fully formed, let's say, as we see in Florence. It's a little bit more decorative in the surfaces. We have the kind of sinuous, elongated figures. We see an emphasis on sort of the Byzantine style here, but it moves away from Byzantine style because we have, again, much more fully formed images. Now, this maestro, remember I mentioned, is having the Madonna and Child with saints and prophets. And here we have not only the saints of that time, but we also, we have Sienese saints who are part of, quote, the standard set of saints. We have the Madonna in this architectural throne. You actually see elements of a building. They look on to her. We see a more fully formed Jesus, but Duccio really was the father of Sienese painting. And this was part of a large polyptych with predella, this huge, massive altarpiece that was now in the Duomo in Siena. Now, Simone de Martini came a little after or similar to the time period of Duccio, was influenced by Duccio, and he does also another Maestra Madonna, Madonna with Angels and Saints, and this is the Palazzo Pubblico. What was different about Siena as opposed to Florence is that Florence had a lot of these very high-born individuals, as I said, the Medici family, for example, who commissioned a lot of artwork. In Siena, there was this big quest for good government, we'll see in just a second, and a little bit of a very political nature to Siena, meaning that the city government often promoted the work of these great artists. So I'm not going to talk too much about this, but I just want to show you that with this fresco in the Palazzo Pubblico, which has not only political and government frescoes, but also this one, of course, is religious, you just see how beautifully he's able to gain perspective at such an early age. Remember, this is the time of the Proto-Renaissance, but you can see this beautiful canopy, this blue and red canopy over the angels and saints and the Madonna enthroned. And you see this very Gothic element, pointed spires that rise up to heaven. But what you see is how the figures are put together, so to speak. They're not in these awkward lineups. It's more, a little bit more of a register and a little bit more of three-dimensionality incorporated. Now, Simone de Martini probably did one of the most beautiful Annunciations, and this is tempera on wood in the Uffizi. It's one of my favorite pieces. They're done a little bit later. And what we have here is Saint Margaret here on the right. And she was a saint of like lost causes, of the downtrodden, the homeless, the mentally ill. So she was a very important patron saint. And then we also have, so Margaret and Saint Ananias, and he was the patron saint of the city of Siena. And we have this beautiful Annunciation in this multiple arches. And we have here, Gabriel brings, here we have the white lilies, and he brings, it escapes me, the greenery that represents Mary, and of course the lilies, and he kneels with these exquisite wings and this flowing down. And she has been reading. So she is holding a Bible or religious text, and she sits on a throne, and she greets him with a little bit of hesitation. So very remarkable Annunciation. Now, since time is a little bit of the essence, I want to talk to you just a minute or two about Pietro Lorenzetti. Ambrogio Lorenzetti, Pietro Lorenzetti did Ambrogio did the good and bad government frescoes in the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena. Was able to see those a couple of years ago. Really remarkable. But there are some religious paintings nearby in the Duomo. And this is a particularly interesting triptych formation on tempera. And it shows three scenes, well, not exactly scenes, but three vignettes. So here we have a Joaquin, the father of Mary, and he has an older gentleman waiting with him and a young boy in attendance, and they're waiting to hear about the birth of Mary. And she is seen here in the room with Saint Anne is reclining in a bedchamber, or we have Mary, baby Mary, being washed by attendants. And she's on this very typical Renaissance, and you'll later see this in the Baroque, canopied bed, which is beautiful, star pointed roof here. And that was very typical of the Florentine style in the Renaissance. And also in Siena, as we see here. And then we have attendants coming to bring waters to cleanse and cloth to dry the baby. And then, of course, this elaborate floor. So again, the Palazzo Pubblico and the Duomo, they had these beautiful frescoes that tell people sort of how to behave in the city of Siena, because as I said, Siena was really very interested in good government. Now, tragically, Ambrogio Lorenzetti dies not too long after these frescoes were painted, as did his brother. They both died of the plague. As I mentioned, the plague decimates Siena. Now, what do we have here? We have the representation. There are 6 of these frescoes, and they show how, with people working together and voting and following the seasons and good manners and good behavior, we have a very successful government. And we have, this isn't God the Father, this is actually the representation, the metaphorical representation of good government. And then we have religious and actually, but most likely figures from that time period. And what we have here are the little putti that kind of tell us about more religious things like charity and kindness, and they kind of float over. But then we have here the forms of government that tell us that judgment and rational behavior should be part of good government. And some of the other frescoes that are not shown here, this is of course a detail, show a countryside that had plague and disease and buildings that were not maintained and crops that were not gathered. So it's really a way of telling people didactically how government should function. So when you enter this chamber, here's the doorway, and then it is painted from below looking up, di sotto in su. Again, of course, I'm running out of time, and I just want to go in. The raising of Lazarus, the Duccio, so perhaps I should have shown this a little bit earlier, but this is, I'm going to show you too, how they were done 100 years apart. Again, this is Sienese, and it shows the raising of Lazarus, which shows Lazarus died, and 4 days later, Jesus was able to resurrect him. It foreshadows his own resurrection, but it's very interesting because this is a very early work. This is really still almost proto-Renaissance. And look how fully formed these figures are. They look very true. We have Lazarus. Initially, he was in a horizontal sarcophagi. This is freestanding. He's in a cave. And if you see, this is sort of, in a way, a little humorous because he's been dead for 4 days and the smell is horrendous, malodorous. And so some of the people are holding a cloak. Now, because I do want to talk about one to compare it, this is Giovanni de Paolo, and 100 years, approximately 100 years later, he does the same topic, but look how things have evolved. This is almost kind of elongated form, which foreshadows mannerism. Later on, we have a marble door that is taken off the recessed sarcophagi. We have all kinds of manner of saints and prophets, and every detailed face, each face is really unique. And then of course we have this rocky promontory, and then the body of Lazarus. This is actually, this work is in, panel work is in the Baltimore Museum. Now, Taddeo de Bartolo, this Ilse, who studied art history, who you met a little bit earlier on, was very helpful in talking a lot about this painting because I was a little confused. So when I look at it closely, you see the cherub, angel cherubs. The red comes from a Hebrew term like, I forget the term, but it kind of relates to the use of red and light. And we have, so these form almost look like wings for the Madonna, and this exquisite tempera on panel. She is elegantly dressed. We sort of see that international Gothic style with details and jewel tones. But really, it's important that we do look at Venetian Renaissance, which is very different. Color, light, a different kind of oil, layering is used in Venetian painting. Bellini was the father of Venetian painting, as was Duccio in Siena and Giotto in Florence. Venice was off the Adriatic as a series of lagoons. It had a lot of influence from the Byzantine Empire. It grappled with the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople. So stylistically, it's very unique. And we have the Madonna in the foreground, and she's of humility. Even her cloak and blue garment lie on the floor. We have a city behind. We have a crow that means death. We have a bird fighting with a snake, good and evil. And we have her completely disassociated from what's happening in the background. So look at the light in the Venetian, and the color was resplendent. I'm a particular fan of Venetian Renaissance painting, and this family, Giovanni Bellini, Jacopo, and one of the other brothers, they were really the dynasty of art in Florence. Now, I promise you there was some portraiture. This is the Doge and Leonardo Loredan, and Bellini was a master of painting portraits, and anybody who knew Bellini at that time would want their portrait painted. And the Doge was sort of the ruling aristocrat. So he was kind of the controller of Florence, pardon me, of Venice. And you can see this particular headdress he wears, very elaborate costuming, this beaded foregarment. And so I'm kind of racing through, but I do want to show you stylistically, Venetian Renaissance, early Renaissance is quite different. And lastly, I do want to talk about one of the most, I'm sorry, this we'll probably not be able to talk about this too much, but this is the Tempest. And of course, the Tempest was a storm made famous 100 years after this painting was done by William Shakespeare. This is the first truly landscape painting, just landscape, and actually the subject is very mysterious. And I'm going to let Ilse find out if we have some questions, which would be wonderful.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Karen. That was such a wonderful presentation, and we do have a couple questions. So the first one in the comments is from Ian and Roxanne, and they ask, is Italo-Gothic just a name for international Gothic painting found in Italy?
No. So if I get, I'm sorry, let's repeat the question if you don't mind. I just want to make sure I have it all.
Is Italo-Gothic just a name for international Gothic painting found in Italy?
So international Gothic, if I understand the question, it really comes more from France and is developed more in France. So in the courts of Avignon, for example, you see elements of international Gothic. You also see it in the Netherlandish regions, in places like Bruges and Ghent. And so it was, remember, as I mentioned, stylistically, there's all kinds of inspiration and influence. So remember, some of these artists did know the Netherlandish artists. They knew some of these French court, but the international Gothic style, I will say, is connected to the courts, the aristocratic courts of Western Europe and Northern Europe. Does that answer the question, I hope?
So Ian and Roxanne actually ask another question.
Sure.
They say, I understand Duccio and Giotto were both students of Cimabue, I think.
Yes, not Giotto so much, although he might have been influenced by Cimabue, but Duccio definitely influenced by Cimabue.
And they ask, where does he stand in the early Renaissance?
Who? I'm sorry, I missed that one.
It starts with, I understand Duccio and Giotto were both students of Cimabue. I'm not sure who it's referencing.
Well, Duccio 100% studied with Cimabue. And they think that Giotto might have been influenced by him as well, but 100% Duccio.
Okay, so if anybody would like to add anything else, the comment box is open. I don't believe we have something from the Facebook Live. I did want to just comment and say that the Lamentation over the Dead Christ reminds me of a Kathy Kollwitz woodcut print, like a World War I print. It's very naturalistic and actually feels very intimate, I think.
Oh, she was a wonderful artist. So, too bad we lost her at too young of an age. But yeah, it's a real, that Lamentation is so unique because at first glance, it looks like hyper three-dimensional in form, but if you look at the foreshortening of the feet and how the body is just compressed, but that's unimportant. I mean, it's really what's important is the elegiac and tragic nature of the image. So I think he captures it with brilliance. But what's so amazing stylistically, how he can move from two different styles is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, certainly. I just think it's such a modern looking work for the 1400s. It's so
Absolutely.
different.
Very good point. And just even the facial characteristics, and just as you said, Quetzalcoatlus kind of replicates that form later in the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It is like just strange to see because the colors are so much more muted than these other early Renaissance works. But
right, it's almost in Versailles, that kind of grayish palette, very, and you look at his other works, they're so colorful and just light filled, and this is muted, monochromatic, very gray and toned down. Absolutely, good point.
I absolutely love all these works. It was so much fun working on this presentation with Karen, and thank you so much again. And I'd like to remind everyone before you go that this tour and other tours put on previously through the museum can be found on our social media channels, our Facebook or YouTube page. And if you'd like further information on future tours put on by the museum, please check out our website events calendar for those details. And thank you again so much for joining us this morning. And thank you, Karen, once more for everything, and goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Let's see.